Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 4 of our Raspberry Pi series, and today we're going to be looking at how to secure your Raspberry Pi server on your network. We are going to limit the attack surface that hackers use to exploit your device, and we're going to be making some security changes to just harden it up to protect your data on your Raspberry Pi. If you haven't watched our previous episodes up until now, I would recommend going back and watching them because it get you to this point where we are now. I'll just give you a brief outline of what we've done. We've set up our Raspberry Pi on our network. We've installed Raspberry Pi OS. We've enabled SSH, and we are now ready to start securing it. We are using Windows 10 today, and we're going to use an application called PuTTY. If you haven't got that installed, then there will be a link in the description below on how to install that. Okay, so we're ready. We're going to start securing our Raspberry Pi. We're going to load up PuTTY, and then if you don't know your IP address of your Raspberry Pi, there's a link in the description on how to find that. I know mine. Mine is 192.168.2.5. And it's on the default port, which is 22. And I click open. And say yes. And I'm going to log in with Pi. And my password is Raspberry. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the Raspberry Pi password for the Pi user. By default, this is Raspberry. Every hack tool on the market knows that the Raspberry Pi uses these default values, so it's very important that we change the password. We're going to use the built-in Raspberry config, which is built into Raspberry Pi OS. So we're going to go sudo raspi tac config. So we're going to click on number 1, system options. And then we're going to go down to S3 password. And press enter on it. So we're now going to enter our new password for our Pi user. Okay. So I'm going to put a password that I know. And then you've got to confirm it. And then the password's been successfully changed. So that's one easy step to secure your Raspberry Pi. So now you've done that, we can navigate down to finish. So we can take this a step further. We know that Raspberry Pi OS uses default values for its username and password, which is Pi and Raspberry. So what we can do now, we've changed the password. What would be another good step is to change the default Pi user. What we're going to do is we're going to lock that account so it can't be used, and we're going to create a new user, and then we're going to use that user to connect. Now the glory of doing this is that whoever's attacking your Raspberry Pi, your username could be anything. They're not going to know what that username is. So it's just going to give an extra bit of security. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go sudo add user. And then you're going to put your username here. So whatever you want your username to be. I'm going to use the username user1. And then you press enter. And then it's going to ask you for a password for that user. So I'm going to put a password in. And then it's going to ask you to confirm it. And then what you can do here is you can put in any extra fields that you'd like to put in there just to give the user account a bit more detail. But personally, I never see the point in this, so I just enter it, straight through, right to the end. And then right at the very end, press Y and then enter. So we've created the user now. So what we've got to do now is give that user permissions, okay? So the permissions that it's going to need is admin rights and sudo rights, which is super user do. This basically gives it root permissions so it can run root commands. So we need to add them 2 permissions to this user. So we're going to go sudo gpass wd tac a, and then my username, which was user1, and then you put your username in there, and then adm, so that will give it admin rights. And then we're going to do sudo gpass again, wd tac a, user1, and then we're going to add that to the sudo group. So just to check that your username is in the correct groups, what we're going to do is we're going to go groups, and then we're going to put our username. You put yours, user1, and then it will tell you what groups it's in. So you can see it's in the admin and the sudo group, which is exactly what we want. Now that we've got the correct permissions on our user and we are in the correct groups, what we're going to do now is we're going to open up a fresh PuTTY window, and then we're going to connect to a fresh terminal window. So 192, again, you put your IP address here. 168.2.5 is mine. And then we're going to open it. And this time, we're going to log in as user 1. And then we're going to use our password. And as you can see, I've connected. One other check that we've got to do is to make sure that we have sudo rights. So I'm going to put sudo hostname. So that'll try and run that command as hostname. And it's saying that's fine. And then what we're going to do is put our password in. And there you go. It's worked. So we have sudo rights too. Now the final thing we've got to do here is to lock the Pi account. And the reason why we can't completely remove it or disable it is a lot of updates and things that the Raspberry Pi OS relies on the Pi account. So we don't want to cause any problems that way. So all we have to simply do is just lock the Pi account. That way no one can use that account, no one can log in using Pi, and no one can use the Pi account. So all we've got to run now is sudo passwd tac alpha lock and then the Pi user, and then you press return. Password, expiry information changed. Okay, so now if we cross out of here and then we go back into a new PuTTY window, putting our IP address in again, and then we try and connect again. Right, and this time we're going to try and connect as Pi, and we put our password in. And as you can see, it's not letting us log in. That's exactly what we want. So we've secured SSH with a new user account. So the next step that we can take is by changing the default SSH port. A lot of hackers use hack tools and scripts to exploit the Raspberry Pi that look for default values. As I explained before, it looks for the default username, default password, but it also looks for the default SSH port. So what we're going to do is we're going to move that SSH port to another port. Now this doesn't give you complete security, like, you know, because port scanners can find the port, okay, and they can see the service that's running on that port. But, you know, it takes extra steps for a hacker to exploit it. The hacker would have to be very determined to do additional scans on your network to find that information. So we're going to do that now. We're going to change the port for your SSH. Okay, so the first thing we've got to do is edit the sshd_config file. So we do that by going sudo space nano space /etc/sshd_config, and then we press return. Now this file has all the configurations for your SSH daemon. So we're going to be making a few changes to this file during this episode. So what we're going to do now is we're going to change the port number. So if you use the arrow keys to navigate down to where it says port 22, we are going to take away the hash, okay? And then we're going to change 22 to 1984. And then we're going to press Control X to exit, and then Y for yes, and then enter. Now that's saved, okay? And then just to check, you can press up arrow to go back in, and you can check that it's changed, which it has. Again, Control X, and we're out of there again. What we're going to do is we're going to restart the SSH service. Sudo space service space SSH space restart. Okay, so we've restarted the service. Now we're going to open a fresh window again to make sure that we don't get disconnected from our Raspberry Pi if we've made any mistakes. So we're going to do it again, 192.168.2.5. But this time the port we're going to use is 1984. And then click open. And then click yes. And as you can see, we've connected fine. So we're going to use our user 1 and then our password. And there you are, we are connected. You can close out the old window now. And we've now changed the Raspberry Pi port. The next security measure that you can take is to keep your Raspberry Pi updated. Now there's several ways that you can do this. I always recommend to manually update it. You can put a reminder in your calendar to remind you maybe to do it once a month. just to come into the terminal window and run this command. There is ways to automate this process, but I don't recommend doing that, because if something breaks, you're not going to know that it's broken until, you get complaints from whoever's using the services, until the whole system goes down or anything, some quite bad things can happen. So it's always best to manually run all updates and then check your services to make sure that they are working correctly. So to update your Raspberry Pi, you need to run two commands. It's sudo apt update and sudo apt upgrade. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine that into one command that we're going to use, and we're using the TAC-Y flag so that we don't have to press yes at the prompt. So this is what you run: sudo space apt space update space TAC-Y space ampersand ampersand space sudo space apt space upgrade space TAC-Y. So now that will run both commands one after the other. Now all you've got to do now is enter your password. Now that's running, we are going to grab ourselves a cup of tea, and I'll see you back here when it's finished. If you guys are enjoying our content, if you can give us a like and a subscribe, that would be great. If you click the notification bell, you'll be notified of any new content that we put up. Okay, another step that you can take to harden the security of your Raspberry Pi, you can limit the user accounts that are allowed to connect through SSH. Basically, you can lock it down to one user, so that if anyone's trying any other user accounts, or if you actually have more than one user account on that device, they can't use it to exploit your device. So they can't exploit root or anything like that. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the sshd_config file. And then we're going to press enter. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to go down to where it says authentication. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a new line here, and we're just going to put allow users, and then our user account that we set up. Mine is user1. Now if you had multiple accounts that you wanted to allow access to SSH, so let's say you had user2, user3, you could just separate it by a comma, and you could put user2, comma, user3. And that will allow SSH access for all them different user accounts. So we're going to remove them because we only want the one account. And again, we're going to press Control Exit, and then Y for yes to write the changes, and then enter. And then we can double check it by pressing up again and just popping in, going back down to authentication, and we can see that the change has taken place. So all we've got to do now is we need to restart the SSH service, which we can do by running again sudo service ssh restart. And then what we're going to do now is we're going to keep this Raspberry Pi window open again. So now we're going to open up a fresh PuTTY terminal window, and we're going to put in 192.168.2.5 and our port, which is 1984, and then we're going to click open, and then we're going to log in as user1. And then we're going to log in with our password. And there you are, we're in. Now there is one more step that you can take to secure your SSH. It is to actually enable SSH keys. This is obviously an advanced step, and it is a whole topic in itself. I'm going to have a dedicated blog post on the website that talks about SSH keys, and I'm also going to do a YouTube video to go along with that, as it's quite an in-depth kind of subject. I want to talk a little bit about keys, how they work. We are going to need it for the series. We're not going to need to do this until much later, so I think it's probably wise to leave this out of this section. But enabling a Raspberry Pi to use SSH keys and disabling password authentication is definitely a recommended security step that you can take. So the final thing that you can do to secure your Raspberry Pi is to install a firewall. Now there's one called Uncomplicated Firewall, UFW. There is a link in the description if you want to install a firewall, but for our series I would recommend not installing the firewall, because we're going to be using our Raspberry Pi on our local network, and any services that we are going to enable from the outside, we're going to take additional steps to secure that using reverse proxies. We're going to get into that later on. In episode 5 we're going to be looking at how to install Open Media Vault on your Raspberry Pi, and how to configure that and use that for Docker and other services. So all that leaves me to say now is thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.